It was a warm afternoon in the city, the kind of day when the air feels heavy but peaceful, and most people are simply trying to make it home without trouble. Cars rolled down the wide avenue at an easy pace. At a distance, the sound of birds mixed with the soft buzz of traffic. No one expected anything unusual to happen. The day felt normal, quiet, and calmed out. In the middle of this calm drove a woman named Ava. She had spent the morning finishing work at her office and was finally heading toward a meeting across town. She kept her window cracked slightly, letting a little bit of the warm breeze in, and hummed lightly at a song playing on the radio. Ava liked peaceful drives like this, where she could take a breath and reset her mind before jumping into the next task. Her job often required focus, long hours, and calm thinking, so she valued small moments like these. Ava's car was clean and simple, nothing loud or flashy. She kept her papers organized in a folder on the passenger seat. She always double-checked her route, her schedule, and her meeting notes before leaving. She believed in being prepared for everything. But as prepared as she was, there are some moments in life that no preparation can stop. This afternoon was one of those moments. She noticed a police car a few cars behind her. She did not think much of it at first. Police cars moved through traffic every day. Most people barely gave them a second thought unless sirens came on. And Ava had no reason to expect anything. She wasn't speeding, her turn signals were working, and she was going exactly where she needed to be. But in the mirror, after a few blocks, she noticed the police car was still there, still behind her, not passing, not turning, not slowing down. It simply stayed. She kept driving calmly. A minute later, the police car changed lanes and moved closer. Ava glanced at her speedometer. She was at the correct limit. She checked her seat belt. Secure. She checked her mirrors again. Clear. Everything was normal. Then she heard it. The short, sharp chirp of a siren. Not the loud wailing kind used for emergencies, but the quick, hey, pull over type. Red and blue lights flashed behind her. Ava's heart sank a little. Not in fear, but in confusion. She signaled and gently pulled over to the side of the road, stopping smoothly next to the curb. She took a deep breath. It was a habit she had learned long ago. Stay calm, stay steady, stay respectful. She always believed that calmness kept things from getting worse. She placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen clearly. Another habit she had built over the years, just to avoid misunderstandings. She watched the side mirror as the officer stepped out of his vehicle. The officer walked with firm, quick steps. His face looked tense, though Ava couldn't tell if that was his natural expression or if something had upset him earlier in the day. His uniform was neat, and his badge caught the sunlight for a second as he approached. Thought ran through Ava's mind. I wasn't breaking any rules. Why am I being pulled over? She tried to remain calm. She had dealt with tense situations before, mostly in her work. She knew people sometimes reacted out of habit or misunderstanding or pressure. She reminded herself that she didn't know this officer, and he didn't know her. The officer stopped by her window. She slowly lowered it, just enough to hear him clearly and respond. She kept her voice gentle. Good afternoon, officer. Is something wrong? She asked. The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared into the car with a look that felt more like he was searching for trouble than conducting a simple stop. His eyes moved over her face, then to the passenger seat, then to the back seat, then back to her. License and registration, he said sharply. No greeting, no explanation. Just the demand. Ava nodded politely. Of course. May I reach into my bag to get them? She always asked first. It was safer and clearer. The officer sighed, as if the question annoyed him. Just do it, he muttered. She moved slowly, carefully, opening her bag and pulling out her wallet. She passed him her license. Her hand stayed steady, even though she felt a slight knot forming in her stomach. The officer glanced at her license, but didn't really seem to read it. Then he looked at her again. "This your car?" he asked, his tone almost accusing. "Yes," Ava replied calmly. "Is there a problem?" The officer didn't answer her question. Instead, he leaned a little closer to the window, squinting at her as if trying to find something wrong. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "I'm going to a meeting across town," she said. "Just work. What kind of work?" he asked quickly. Ava paused for a moment, not sure why her job mattered. But she answered honestly. "I work for the state," she said. "I'm on my way to meet with a few colleagues." The officer exhaled loudly through his nose. The expression on his face didn't soften. In fact, it grew sharper, almost suspicious. "Step out of the car," he said. Ava blinked, taken aback. "May I ask why?" "Step out of the car," he repeated, firmer this time, as if her question was some kind of challenge. Ava had seen situations like this before, not in her personal life often, but in cases she had handled, in testimonies she had read, in complaints she had reviewed. She knew how quickly a simple stop could turn tense. She didn't want that. She didn't want conflict. She nodded gently. "All right," she said. She unlocked her door and stepped out slowly. The sidewalk felt warm beneath her shoes. She stood with her hands at her sides, staying calm. The officer circled around her car, looking at it from every angle as if trying to find something wrong. "Do you know why I stopped you?" he asked suddenly. Ava looked at him carefully. "I'm not sure," she said truthfully. "I wasn't speeding, and all my signals were on." The officer didn't confirm or deny anything. Instead, he frowned. "Your story isn't matching up," he said. "My story?" Ava repeated softly, a little confused. "I'm just driving to a meeting." The officer folded his arms. "You seem nervous," he said. "Most people who are hiding something act nervous." Ava took another slow breath. She kept her voice steady. "Anyone would feel nervous being pulled over without knowing the reason," she said. "I promise I'm cooperating fully." He didn't respond to her explanation. Instead, he continued circling the car, checking the license plate, the windows, the tires, everything. Ava watched him silently, feeling a mix of confusion and sadness. She had seen officers who worked with respect and fairness. She had met many who served their communities with real care. But she also knew some acted on assumptions, and sometimes those assumptions came from the wrong place. People walked by on the sidewalk, glancing over briefly before moving along. A couple across the street slowed their steps, sensing that something about the stop felt heavier than normal. Ava stood still, wishing the officer would simply explain why she had been pulled over. After a few minutes of searching, the officer came back toward her. "Pop the trunk," he said. Ava felt her chest tighten slightly. "Officer," she said gently, "may I know the reason for this search? I haven't been told what I've done wrong." The officer stepped closer, his tone sharp. "Do it now." She didn't want the situation to escalate. She reached into the car and pulled the lever to open the trunk. The officer walked over and lifted it fully. He looked through a small box of supplies she kept there, jumper cables, a spare jacket, a pair of driving gloves. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. Ava watched him sift through the items, still without a word explaining what he was looking for. She felt the knot in her stomach tighten a little more. She tried to remain calm. She reminded herself over and over, stay steady, stay patient. After several long minutes, the officer closed the trunk and approached her again. His shoulders were tense, and his eyes held a look she couldn't quite read, part frustration, part confusion, part something she didn't want to assume. He looked at her license again, then at her. "You sure this is your car?" he asked once more. "Yes," Ava said softly. "It is." He stared at her for a long moment, as if trying to uncover something that wasn't there. The silence stretched between them, uncomfortable and heavy. Ava could feel the attention growing from people passing by. Not many stopped, but several slowed, their eyes drifting toward the scene. Ava didn't move. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She just waited for him to reach some kind of conclusion. The officer glanced toward his vehicle, as if considering calling someone. Then he looked back at her. "Stay here," he said finally, and he walked back to his patrol car. Ava watched him go, trying to understand what had led to this moment. She had been driving quietly, following every rule, moving through her day like anyone else. And yet, here she stood on the side of the road, feeling treated as if she were doing something wrong when she knew she wasn't. She closed her eyes for a moment and took another steadying breath. She knew the situation wasn't resolved yet. She could sense there was more coming. She could sense the officer wasn't done. And even though she didn't know exactly what would happen next, she prepared herself, reminding herself that she had done nothing wrong and had nothing to hide. She kept her hands visible. She kept her posture relaxed. She waited calmly, even though confusion and unease swirled quietly in her chest. The peaceful afternoon she had been enjoying just minutes earlier was long gone. Something heavier had taken its place, and she could only hope the rest of the encounter would not get any worse. Ava stood quietly by the curb, trying to keep her breathing steady as the officer sat inside his patrol car. She couldn't see what he was doing, but she could imagine him typing her name into whatever system he used, checking for anything he could hold against her. She knew there wouldn't be anything. She had never been in trouble, never even received a parking ticket. Yet she felt uneasy, as if she were waiting for a decision that had nothing to do with facts. Cars continued rolling down the street. Most drivers barely noticed the situation, but a few turned their heads, curious about why a woman stood outside her car while a police officer remained inside his. Ava felt their eyes, though no one said anything. She wished she had some kind of certainty, some kind of clue about how the next few minutes would unfold. A soft breeze brushed past her, doing little to cool the warm air. The sun sat high, making the sidewalk hot beneath her feet. Her meeting was scheduled to begin soon, and even though she didn't want to let stress in, she felt time slipping away. She didn't want to be late, especially not for the kind of meeting she had planned, a meeting that involved reviewing public service practices. The irony wasn't lost on her. She looked over at the officer's car. He still hadn't stepped out. She didn't know if that was good or bad. Part of her wanted the stop to be over already. Another part wanted him to at least explain why he'd pulled her over in the first place. Finally, after what felt like much longer than it actually was, he stepped out. He shut his door a little harder than necessary and walked back toward her with a look of irritation on his face, as if she had done something wrong. He stopped in front of her. "Your plate looks like it might not match the system," he said. Ava blinked. "Might not?" she repeated softly. "Is there a mistake?" He didn't answer directly. Instead, he looked her over again, like he was trying to fit her into some idea he had already formed in his head. "Where did you say you were going?" he asked again. "I'm going to a work meeting," she said, keeping her tone neutral and polite. "What kind of work?" he repeated. She hesitated. Earlier, her answer about working for the state seemed to irritate him, and she wasn't sure why. But she wasn't going to lie or avoid the truth. She just wanted to say it plainly. "I work in a legal department," she said, offering a small, calm explanation. But the officer's expression didn't soften. If anything, he seemed even more skeptical. "Legal department?" he repeated, almost to himself. Right. Ava felt a pinch of frustration in her chest, but she didn't let it reach her voice. She simply said, "Yes, that's right." He stood silently for a moment, as if deciding what to do. Then he said, "I'm going to need you to stand over by the front of your car." Ava nodded and walked slowly toward the front bumper. Her movements were steady, careful. She didn't want to seem nervous, even though she was. She didn't want to seem upset, even though she felt a swirl of emotions inside. She stood where he told her, her hands lightly clasped in front of her. He circled her car again. Once, twice. He checked every window, every corner, the hood, the trunk, the tires. It was as if he was searching for a reason to justify his suspicion. Ava watched quietly. She didn't want to make the situation worse by questioning him repeatedly, even though she had the right to know what was happening. She reminded herself that staying calm was the best path forward for her safety, for her dignity, and for the outcome. A couple of teenagers walked by on the opposite sidewalk, whispering to each other. Ava could hear only small parts of their conversation. "Looks serious," one murmured. "Yeah." "Wonder what she did," the other said. Ava felt her stomach twist at that comment. She wanted to shout, "I did nothing," but she didn't. She just stood still. After a few more minutes, the officer walked over to her again. His tone wasn't loud, but it was firm and unkind. "You said this is your car," he said. "Yes," Ava replied gently. "Do you have proof of ownership?" Ava nodded slowly. "Yes, the registration is in the glove compartment." "Get it," he said. Ava took a careful step toward her car. "I'm going to reach into the glove compartment now," she said, speaking clearly so he could hear her intentions. He nodded stiffly. She opened the door, leaned inside, and pulled out the registration folder. Then she handed it to him. He looked at it for a moment, flipping through the pages. But instead of seeming satisfied, he looked even more doubtful. "These papers look new," he said. Ava's eyebrows lifted slightly. "They're updated," she explained. "I had them replaced last month when I renewed everything." The officer didn't respond. He just stared at the papers as if he were looking for some hidden flaw. Ava felt a wave of weariness settle over her. She knew this wasn't about her car. It wasn't about her registration. It wasn't even about her destination. This had nothing to do with any actual problem, but she still stayed calm. The officer handed back the papers. "Step away from the car again," he said. Ava stepped back to the spot he'd directed earlier. She could feel the sun heating the top of her head, the warmth becoming uncomfortable. She tried focusing on her breathing to keep herself steady. The officer spoke into his radio, though she couldn't hear all the words. It sounded like he was calling for something, maybe backup, maybe confirmation, maybe approval. Ava didn't know, but she knew the situation was growing heavier. A man walking his dog stopped across the street, watching with a cautious look. He didn't approach, but his concern was noticeable. Ava wondered what this scene looked like from the outside. She wondered what story people were imagining. Her phone buzzed inside her bag. It was probably someone from the meeting, wondering where she was. She wanted to answer, but she didn't dare reach for anything without permission. After a minute, the officer's radio crackled with a reply. He listened, his jaw tightening. He didn't look pleased with whatever he was told. He walked back toward Ava. "Your information checks out," he said in a tone that sounded more like frustration than relief. Ava nodded, hoping this meant the stop was finally ending. But it wasn't. "I still need to ask you some more questions," he said. Ava kept her voice level. "All right," she said softly. He looked at her closely, his eyes narrowing again. "You said you work for the state." "Yes. What exactly do you do?" Ava hesitated for just a moment, not out of fear, but because she sensed that no matter what she said, he wasn't going to accept it easily. I work in legal compliance, she said, mostly reviewing and improving public service policies. The officer stared at her as though he didn't believe a single word. Sounds fancy, he said skeptically. It's not really, Ava said gently. It's just part of my job. He folded his arms. You have any proof of that? Ava thought for a moment. She did have proof her work badge was in her bag, but she also knew officers didn't usually demand proof of someone's job on a traffic stop. Still, she wanted the situation to de-escalate. I can show you my badge, she said carefully. It's in my bag? He looked at her bag, then at her. Fine, he said, but move slowly. Ava nodded. She opened her bag slowly and gently. She reached inside and felt around for the ID holder. It took her a moment, but she found it. She held it out for him to see. The officer took it from her hand. His eyes scanned the card. Then he looked at her again. Not softer, not kinder, just more confused. This doesn't look like something you'd have, he said. Ava felt a deep sadness at those words. She knew exactly what he meant, even if he didn't say it directly. It's my badge, she said simply. The officer turned it over, looked at it again, then handed it back without comment. Ava placed it gently back in her bag. She hoped that maybe now he would realize she wasn't hiding anything. Maybe now he would let her go. But instead, he said, I'm going to have you wait until my supervisor arrives. Ava's heart sank. May I ask why? She said quietly. He shook his head. Just wait. Ava didn't argue. She stood still, feeling the weight of the moment press down even harder. Minutes passed. People walked by with uncertain glances. The man with the dog eventually moved on, but not before giving her a small, sympathetic nod. Ava didn't know how long she had been standing there, but it felt like forever. She had never felt so misunderstood, so judged without reason. She had faced tough meetings, challenging cases, and long nights of work. But none of that felt as draining as this moment, being treated as if she didn't belong, as if she couldn't possibly be who she said she was. Finally, in the distance, she heard another car approaching. It was another patrol car. Her shoulders tensed slightly. The officer stepped forward as the second car parked behind his. Two officers stepped out, one older, with a calmer expression, and one younger who looked unsure. Ava hoped quietly, gently, that maybe this would be the turning point. She stood straight, her hands visible, her posture calm. She reminded herself again. Stay steady. She watched as the first officer walked over to speak with the arriving supervisor. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could feel that this moment would decide what came next. Ava watched as the first officer walked toward the supervisor, speaking in a quick, almost defensive tone. She couldn't hear the words, but she could sense the tension from his movements, the stiff shoulders, the sharp gestures, the way he kept glancing back at her as if trying to justify something. The older supervisor listened calmly, hands resting lightly on his belt, expression unreadable. The younger officer stood a step behind him, watching everything with uncertain eyes. The sun had climbed a bit higher in the sky, casting longer shadows on the ground. Ava felt the heat pressing down on her, warming her hair and shoulders. She shifted her weight slightly, hoping to ease the discomfort, but she stayed in the same calm posture. She didn't want any sudden movements to be misinterpreted. Across the street, a small group of people had stopped near a bus stop bench. They weren't trying to stare, but their curiosity was clear. A woman adjusted her sunglasses, watching from behind them. A man stood with folded arms, glancing between the officers and Ava. Another woman held her phone, not recording, but clearly debating whether she should. People sensed when something didn't feel right, and this scene made some of them uneasy. Ava's heart felt heavy. She couldn't shake the feeling of being misunderstood, judged, and placed in a situation she didn't deserve. She wanted to believe that the supervisor would clear everything up, that reason would replace suspicion. But she had been in the world long enough to know that hope didn't always lead to quick solutions. After a few minutes, the supervisor nodded to the first officer, then turned toward Ava. He walked at a steady pace, not rushed, not aggressive. When he reached her, he gave a small, polite nod in action that instantly softened the atmosphere. "Hello," he said in a calm, even tone. "I'm Sergeant Lane. I understand there has been a traffic stop involving you." Ava nodded gently. "Yes, Sergeant," she replied. "I was pulled over, but I still haven't been told why." The sergeant glanced back at the first officer briefly, then looked at her again. "Let me ask a few questions so I can better understand the situation," he said. Ava appreciated his tone. It was different, measured, and respectful. "Is this your vehicle?" He asked, double quotes. "Yes, it is," she answered. "Do you have your registration and license?" "Yes, I showed them already. May I see them as well?" "Of course." Ava reached slowly into her bag and handed her registration and license to him. He looked them over carefully, not suspiciously, but simply verifying the information. Then he nodded. "These appear to be in order," he said. Ava let out the smallest breath of relief, but didn't relax completely. "May I ask where you're headed today?" He continued. "I'm on my way to a work meeting," she said gently. "Across town. What kind of work do you do?" he asked, but his tone didn't carry the doubt the first officers had. "I work in legal compliance," Ava replied. The sergeant nodded again. "Do you have any identification related to that?" She reached into her bag once more and handed him her work badge. He examined it briefly, then gave it back. "Thank you," he said. For a moment, the sergeant said nothing. He simply looked at Ava, taking in her calm posture, the heat of the day, the way she stood waiting. Then he turned to the first officer and motioned him over. The first officer approached, shoulders tense, jaw tight. "We've confirmed everything," the sergeant said quietly to him. "Her documents are valid. The vehicle is registered to her. There doesn't appear to be an issue." The first officer frowned. "But her behavior, there's nothing irregular about her behavior," the sergeant replied firmly. "She's been cooperative and respectful. If there's no concrete violation, we need to move toward clearing her." Ava heard every word. She tried not to let her emotions show, but she felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion washing through her. So much time wasted. So much tension built on assumptions. But just as she began to feel hopeful, the first officer shook his head slightly. "I still think something's off," he insisted. "Her story doesn't match right." The sergeant looked at him with a steady expression. "Her story matches her documents, and the system confirms everything she said." "But what if?" the first officer began. The sergeant gently but firmly cut him off. "Unless there is a specific violation or reason, there is no justification to continue." Ava watched the exchange, feeling the shift in power between them. The first officer looked frustrated, almost embarrassed. The sergeant looked patient but authoritative. The younger officer standing nearby looked between them uncertainly, clearly unsure which side of the conversation he belonged on. A long silence stretched between everyone. Ava stood still, waiting. The sergeant turned back to her. "Thank you for your patience," he said. "I apologize for the delay. We'll finish shortly." His words were polite, more polite than anything she had heard since the stop began. She gave him a small nod, but just as the sergeant prepared to step away, the first officer suddenly said, "I want to check her car again." Ava felt her chest tighten again. The sergeant paused. "You already conducted a search," he said carefully. "She might be hiding something," the first officer muttered. "Hiding what?" the sergeant asked calmly. The first officer didn't answer. His silence said everything. The sergeant took a slow breath. Unless you have specific cause, we cannot continue to search her vehicle. That isn't how we handle these stops. The first officer looked irritated. She seemed nervous. Ava finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. Anyone would feel nervous standing on the side of the road like this, without understanding what they've done wrong. The sergeant glanced at her and nodded subtly, as if acknowledging the truth in her words. The first officer opened his mouth again, clearly not ready to let go. I still think she's not being honest. Ava looked at him with calm eyes. Officer, she said softly, I've answered everything truthfully. He didn't respond. The sergeant looked at him firmly. That's enough, he said in a quiet but decisive voice. The first officer stiffened, unhappy, but said nothing more. The sergeant turned back to Ava. Ma'am, you have been patient throughout this entire process. At this moment, you have fulfilled all requirements. Please wait just a moment while I close the stop properly. Ava nodded again. Thank you, Sergeant. The supervisor walked back to his patrol car, leaving the younger officer and the first officer standing nearby. The younger officer looked uncomfortable, like he wanted to say something but didn't dare. The first officer stood rigidly, arms crossed. Eyes fixed on the ground. Ava felt a strange mix of emotions: relief that the supervisor was fair, frustration that it had reached this point, embarrassment that people were watching, and exhaustion from the heavy air of suspicion she had stood under for so long. As the sergeant worked, the younger officer slowly approached Ava. He stopped a polite distance away. Ma'am, he said quietly, thank you for staying calm. Ava looked at him. His expression was sincere, almost apologetic. Thank you, she replied softly. He hesitated, then said, I don't think this should have gone this way. Ava heard the honesty in his voice. She appreciated the courage it took for him to say that, even in such a careful manner. Sometimes things get misunderstood, Ava said gently, not wanting to put him in a difficult position. He nodded. I just wanted to say that I appreciate how patient you've been. Before she could respond, the sergeant returned. Ma'am, he said, you are free to go. A simple sentence, but one that carried the weight of everything she had endured that afternoon. Ava nodded slowly. Thank you, Sergeant, she said. The sergeant gave a small, respectful nod. Please drive safely, he added. Ava walked to her car, opened the door carefully, and slid into the seat. The familiar scent of the interior wrapped around her, soft mix of fabric and the faint hint of the lavender freshener she used. A safe space. A normal space. A space she wished she had never been forced to step out of. She closed the door gently. Her hands rested on the steering wheel for a moment as she gathered herself. She realized her palms were slightly damp. Her heart felt heavy, not from fear, but from the long stretch of unfairness she had endured. She started the engine, taking a slow breath as it hummed to life. Through her window, she saw the sergeant walking back to his car. The younger officer gave her a small, apologetic nod before turning away. The first officer, however, didn't look at her. He stood stiffly, jaw tight, frustration radiating from him. Ava didn't let their expression stop her. She pulled gently away from the curb, merging back into the flow of traffic. As her car moved forward, the weight of the stop slowly loosened, though it didn't disappear. She drove quietly, letting the city pass by her windows. People crossing streets. Children holding hands. A cyclist waiting at a red light. The world looked normal again, but Ava felt different, as if something inside her had shifted. Her phone buzzed again inside her bag. Probably someone wondering where she was. She knew she had to call and explain the delay. But for the moment, she just focused on driving calmly, breathing deeply, allowing the simple act of moving forward to settle her nerves. The meeting she was heading to suddenly felt heavier, more personal. Today's experience wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a reminder of issues she worked to address every day. And now, the problem had reached her own doorstep. She continued driving, steady and thoughtful, unaware that what had happened today would soon grow into something much larger, something that would not only affect her, but spark a conversation far be. The late afternoon sun was dipping lower in the sky when the quiet on the street was replaced by the sharp sound of a radio crackling. The tension around the scene grew thicker, almost like the air itself was holding its breath. The officer stood stiff beside his patrol car, trying to keep his voice steady as he spoke into his radio. Across from him, the woman who had been detained sat on the curb, her hands still behind her face calm but tired. She wasn't angry or loud. She wasn't making a scene. She simply looked like someone who had been through this kind of moment one too many times. People who had stopped to watch were growing uneasy. Some were recording from a distance, others whispering quietly among themselves. No one knew what was going to happen next, but most of them sensed the story wasn't going to end the way the young officer expected. The officer kept glancing at the woman's work bag on the ground. Inside, it was the badge he had found, the one he truly wished he had never touched. He had tried to brush it off at first, pretending it didn't change anything, but there was no way to hide the truth. It had shaken him, and the calm look in the woman's eyes made him even more unsure of what he was supposed to do now. Cars drove by slowly, their drivers staring at the odd scene unfolding. The world outside kept moving, but the people standing nearby felt locked in time, waiting. The woman finally shifted slightly, adjusting her posture so her legs wouldn't fall numb. She didn't speak, didn't argue, didn't ask for anything. She simply sat there, quietly observing the officer who had put her in cuffs, without a real reason. He swallowed hard and took a step back from her bag. It was clear he knew he had overstepped. He had treated her like she was guilty, even before he asked her a single calm question. He had assumed things about her that weren't true. And now the truth was staring right back at him, in the form of a badge carrying more authority than he had expected. A few minutes later, the soft hum of another vehicle approaching broke the uneasy silence. A dark gray SUV pulled up, its engine shutting off smoothly. The door opened, and a man in a plain suit stepped out. He wasn't wearing a uniform, but he walked with the confidence of someone who didn't need one. People nearby recognized that look, the look of someone who didn't just show up unless things had gone very wrong. He approached slowly, his steps measured, and the officer's face tightened with worry. The officer's voice cracked slightly as he said, "Sir, this was just a routine stop." But the man in the suit didn't respond right away. He simply looked around, taking in the scene, the woman in cuffs on the curb, the officer trying to keep his composure, the scattered crowd watching closely. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in disappointment. He turned towards the woman and gave her a small nod. She lifted her head slightly. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly. Her voice was calm and steady, almost too calm for someone who had just been put through unnecessary stress. The man nodded again and crouched down next to her, speaking softly. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she replied. "Just ready to get up now." He stood and turned to the officer. "Unlock the cuffs." His tone wasn't loud, but it carried enough weight to make the officer fumble with the keys as he hurried forward. The metal clicked open, and the woman rubbed her wrists gently. She didn't shoot the officer a dirty look. She didn't insult him. She simply stretched her fingers and stood up, dusting off her clothes with quiet dignity. The officer tried to explain himself, words tripping over each other. She wasn't cooperating. Her story didn't match her. I thought. The man in the suit held up a hand to stop him. "You don't need to explain to me. Everything will be handled through the correct channels." That sentence, simple as it was, made the officer's stomach twist. He looked around, aware that the crowd had grown larger, aware that some people had captured everything on their phones. There was no hiding from the truth anymore. The woman picked up her bag from the ground and checked the contents quickly. Her ID badge was still inside. She held it for a moment, looking at it with a mix of sadness and resolve, then put it back and closed the bag. "Let's go," the man in the suit said gently. But before she stepped away, she turned back to the officer. Her voice was soft but firm. "You could have asked me a question. A real question. Instead, you assumed I didn't belong in my own car. You assumed things about me that weren't true. That's the part that hurts the most." The officer looked down at the ground. There was no excuse he could make that wouldn't sound empty. She didn't wait for him to respond. She didn't need to hear anything more from him. She walked to the SUV with quiet strength, the man in the suit guiding her with a respectful distance. The people watching stepped aside, giving her room. Some nodded at her, others whispered words of support. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to show that they understood she hadn't deserved any of what had happened. Once she was in the car, the man closed the door gently and walked around to the driver's side. Before he got in, he looked back at the officer one last time. His expression wasn't angry. It was simply the expression of someone who had seen this kind of situation too many times. "You will hear from the department," he said calmly. "Make sure your report is honest." The officer gave a weak nod. "Yes, I will." The SUV pulled away slowly, leaving the officer standing in the fading sunlight. The street grew quieter as people began drifting away, some shaking their heads, others still holding their phones. The officer finally sat down on the curb, the same spot where he had made the woman sit earlier. He rubbed his face with both hands, feeling the weight of what had happened pressing down on him. It wasn't just about a mistake. It was about a pattern he had never questioned. A pattern he had been a part of, without realizing how deeply it affected the people on the other end of his decisions. He stayed there long after everyone had left, long after the sun disappeared. For the first time in a long time, the street felt too quiet, and he felt something unfamiliar, an uncomfortable mix of regret and fear, but also a small spark of something else. Maybe understanding, maybe the start of change, but he knew one thing for certain: nothing about this day would be easy to forget. The morning after the incident felt strangely quiet, as if the world was giving itself a moment to breathe before the next wave of consequences arrived. In a modest office building downtown, the woman sat at her desk with a cup of warm tea in her hands. She hadn't slept much. Every time she closed her eyes, the scene replayed in her mind, herself sitting on that curb. Cuffs around her wrists, strangers watching silently, waiting to see how it would unfold. Even though she was used to difficult situations, being treated like that without a single calm question, without a moment of fairness, still stung deeply. But she also understood something important. What happened wasn't just about her. It was a reflection of a bigger problem, one she had spent years working to fix. Her phone buzzed with a message. It was from the man in the suit, the colleague who had come to pick her up. "Meeting at 10. Leadership wants a full briefing." She sighed, set her tea down, and gathered her notes. She knew this conversation was coming. The department didn't take these matters lightly. At the station across town, the officer was having a very different morning. He sat alone in a small conference room, his uniform crisp but his expression heavy. He had barely slept. Every time he replayed what happened, his stomach twisted. He had made assumptions. He had acted too fast. And now, everything he had done was caught on camera. The body cam, the phones, the witnesses. He couldn't hide from any of it. He tapped his foot nervously as he waited for his supervisor. When the door finally opened, his shoulders tensed. His supervisor stepped in with a folder in hand and a tired expression. "Morning," his supervisor said, taking a seat. "Let's go through your report." The officer nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, sir." But as the supervisor read through the report, his eyes narrowed. "Why did you write that she was resisting?" "The body cam shows she complied with everything you asked." The officer's face burned with embarrassment. I thought, "That's the problem," his supervisor said firmly. "You thought. You didn't check. You didn't listen. You didn't treat her the way you'd treat anyone else." The officer lowered his gaze. He didn't argue. He knew it was true. Back in the office downtown, the woman walked into the meeting room where several department leaders were gathered. She wasn't nervous. She had spoken in tougher rooms before. But she did feel a quiet determination burning inside her. She wanted them to understand what had happened, not just as an incident, but as something that needed to push change forward. "Thank you for coming," one of the directors said kindly. "We reviewed the footage. We're glad you're all right." She nodded. "I appreciate that." They asked her to give a detailed account. She spoke calmly, explaining each moment how the stop began, the officer's tone, his assumptions, the way he dismissed her attempts to speak, the search through her bag, the unnecessary detainment. She didn't embellish anything. She didn't need to. The facts alone were powerful. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. One of the directors sighed softly. "We're launching a formal review, not just of the officer, but of the entire district. This can't be brushed aside." She nodded again. "It shouldn't be. This isn't about punishing someone. It's about preventing something like this from happening again." They admired her composure. She didn't come in angry. She didn't demand anything unreasonable. She simply wanted fairness and progress. Later that afternoon, she stepped outside for some fresh air. Even though she held powerful positions and handled major cases, she was still human. She was still someone who felt the weight of being misjudged, simply for existing. As she leaned against the railing outside the building, a colleague approached, someone who had worked with her for years. "Rough day?" he asked gently. She gave a soft smile. "Long one." He nodded. "I watched the footage. You handled yourself with a lot of grace." "Thank you," she said quietly. "I just wish it didn't happen in the first place." "I know," he replied. "But maybe this time, something good will come from it. People are paying attention." She looked out at the street below. Cars moving, people walking, life continuing like nothing had happened. "I hope so," she whispered. Meanwhile, the officer sat in another meeting, this time with representatives from internal affairs. They asked him questions about his decisions, his assumptions, his conduct. It wasn't a pleasant conversation, and deep down he knew he deserved whatever consequences came. At one point, they asked, "Why did you search her belongings without proper cause?" He hesitated, struggling with the truth. "I didn't believe she was who she said she was." "Why not?" The officer's jaw tightened. He didn't have a good answer, or at least not one he wanted to say aloud. Later, when he left the room, he felt a deep, sinking feeling. He had worn his badge for years. He thought he understood the job, but this exposed something he hadn't wanted to face about himself. As the days passed, news spread quietly through the department. Some officers avoided him. Others offered short nods of sympathy. No one treated him the same. One afternoon, while he sat in the break room staring at a cup of cold coffee, an older officer approached him. "You all right?" the older man asked. The younger officer shook his head. "Not really." The older officer sighed, sitting across from him. "Listen, everyone messes up, but some mistakes hit harder because they show you something you didn't want to see. What matters now is what you do next." The younger officer stared at the table. "I'm scared I ruined my career." "Maybe you damaged it, the older man said honestly. But maybe you can rebuild. If, and only if, you learn from this. Really learn. Those words stayed with him long after the conversation ended. Across town, the woman continued her routine, but something inside her had shifted. She found herself thinking more deeply about the people who faced moments like hers, but didn't have a badge or a title to protect them. She thought about young people who might feel powerless in similar situations. She thought about all the stories she had heard over the years. One evening, she sat at her kitchen table with her notebook open. She wasn't writing a report. She wasn't preparing a case. She was writing her thoughts, something she hadn't done in a while. She wrote about fear, dignity, misunderstanding, and patience. She wrote about how heavy silence can feel. She wrote about how small moments of power can shape a person in ways others never see. She also wrote about hope that change could come, not just from punishment, but from understanding. When she closed the notebook, she felt a small sense of release. The next morning, she met with community leaders. They discussed training programs, outreach efforts, and ways to build trust between officers and residents. People listened to her carefully. She wasn't just another case. They saw her as someone who could bridge gaps. By the end of the meeting, she felt something she hadn't felt since the incident. Purpose. Later that week, she received a message. It was from the officer. He requested a meeting. She stared at the screen for a long moment. She didn't know what he wanted to say. She didn't know if she was ready to hear it. But she also believed in something important, that growth often comes from difficult conversations. She took a slow breath and replied, "Yes, we can meet." The stage was set for a conversation that neither of them would forget. Your 1,700-word Part 6 story will appear here. The sun was still rising when he stepped out of his apartment the next morning. The sky was painted with soft pink and pale gold, the kind of quiet colors that never made a big show, but still made a person stop and breathe for a moment. He stood there for a few seconds, letting the cool air settle around him. The night before still replayed in his mind like a warm echo. The piano, the music, the CEO's words, the feeling he had walked home with, something he hadn't felt in years. Maybe things could change. He didn't know how. He didn't know when. But the thought stayed. He walked to work with a slower pace than usual, not because he was tired, but because his thoughts were heavy in a different way. Not heavy with stress, heavy with possibility. When he reached the building, he expected the morning to be normal. The usual routine: cleaning floors, emptying bins, fixing light bulbs. But as soon as he stepped inside, he noticed something different. People were looking at him, not in a strange way, not in a mocking way, just noticing him. A few gave small smiles. One person nodded politely. Another whispered something to a coworker, both of them glancing at him with wide, curious eyes. He felt his face warm a little. He wasn't used to attention. For years, he'd blended into the background, not because he lacked value, but because no one ever tried to look deeper. Now they were, and it made him feel exposed, but not in a bad way. Before he could fully process it, the elevator opened, and the CEO stepped out. She looked more rested than she did the night before, her eyes bright and focused. But when she saw him, her expression softened instantly. "Good morning," she said. He swallowed, a little nervous. "Good morning. Do you have a moment?" She asked. His heart skipped. "Yes." She gestured toward one of the small meeting rooms off the lobby. "Let's talk." He followed her quietly, unsure what this conversation would be. Part of him worried he had somehow caused trouble. Another part knew that wasn't likely, not with the way she had listened to him last night. When the door closed behind them, she sat down and motioned for him to do the same. "I've been thinking about what you shared," she began. About your music. About your life. About everything you've been carrying on your own. He nodded slowly. I don't want to overstep or make assumptions, she continued, but I want to help. If you'll let me. He looked at her carefully. Help how? She folded her hands gently. First, I want to offer your daughter a full scholarship through our company's education program. It will cover school supplies, after-school classes, tutoring, anything she needs. His breath caught. Second, she said, I want to offer you a new position here. Still steady work. Still reliable hours. But not janitorial. Something where your skills are valued differently. He blinked, stunned. What kind of position? Community arts liaison, she said. We partner with local schools, youth centers, and community groups. We fund programs for kids who can't afford lessons. We run workshops and small events. I want you to be part of that, to help guide the music side of things. He stared at her, unsure he heard correctly. You want me to teach, if you'd like to, or coordinate, or mentor, or simply play. The title can adjust to your comfort. He shook his head slightly. I've never taught anyone before. You've taught yourself, she said softly. That's often the hardest kind. His chest tightened, emotion rising. And finally, she added, I want to give you another opportunity. One you don't have to accept. But I think it could be meaningful. He waited. We're hosting a charity event next month. Hundreds of guests. A fundraiser to support youth programs. I'd like you to perform as the closing act. His heart dropped right into his stomach. I don't know if I can do that, he whispered. I'm not asking for a decision today, she said kindly. Just think about it. He leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed. Everything felt unreal. Too generous, too big, too sudden. I don't want to take something I don't deserve, he said quietly. Her expression softened. You deserve every bit of this. Not because of last night, but because of who you are. Because of what you've survived. Because of the gift you've protected even when life tried to take it from you. He looked down, blinking rapidly. This could change things for you, she added. For your daughter. For your future. He took a shaky breath. This is a lot. I know, she replied gently. Take your time. They sat in silence for a moment before she stood. We'll talk again when you're ready. He nodded, still stunned. After she left, he stayed seated for a while, letting everything settle inside him. His mind raced. His heart pounded. But somewhere beneath all the fear and disbelief was something warm, got hope again. Later that day, during his break, he stepped outside and called his daughter's school. He asked if he could pick her up early. When she came running out with her backpack bouncing behind her, he knelt down and hugged her tight. Guess what? He said softly. What? She grinned. We might have some big changes coming. She tilted her head. Good changes? He smiled. I think so. They walked home together, her small hand wrapped around his. She skipped over cracks in the sidewalk while he drifted between fear and excitement. He didn't tell her everything yet. He didn't want to confuse her. But that night, after she fell asleep, he sat alone at the small keyboard he kept in the corner of the living room. He placed his fingers on the keys. Then he played. Not the same piece from the lobby. Something gentler. Simpler. Something that belonged to the present. Not the past dot as he played. He realized something. He didn't feel the old heaviness. He didn't feel fear. He didn't feel like he was breaking a rule by letting himself enjoy it. He felt free. The next morning, he returned to the office. His mind was clearer. His heart lighter. He found the CEO in her office. I've been thinking about everything, he said, Doc. She looked up. And I want the new job, he said quietly. And the scholarship. Thank you. She smiled warmly. Of course. As for the performance, he swallowed. I'm scared. Really scared. But I think I want to try. Her eyes brightened. You won't be alone. We'll support you. He nodded. Thank you. The next few weeks felt unreal. He met with program coordinators. He visited community centers. He sat with kids who had never touched a piano before. Some were shy. Some were loud. Some were curious. But all of them looked at him with eyes full of possibility. And when the charity event arrived, the hall was filled with hundreds of people. Lights glowed across the room. Families gathered around tables. Kids he had worked with sat in the front rows, waving at him excitedly. He stood backstage, hands shaking. The CEO approached him. You ready? No, he whispered. Then after a breath, but I'll go anyway. She smiled. That's all courage is. He walked onto the stage. The applause surprised him, soft but welcoming. He sat at the piano, a perfect, polished instrument that reflected the stage. Lights. He took a slow breath, then another, and then he played. The room went silent. His music filled the hall, warm and full and honest. It wasn't perfect. His hands trembled once or twice, but none of that mattered. What mattered was the emotion, the life he poured into each note. People listened with full hearts. Some wiped tears. Some closed their eyes. His daughter watched from the front row, her face glowing with pride. When he finished, the applause rose like a wave. Loud, long. He stood slowly, overwhelmed. The CEO nodded at him from the side of the stage, her eyes full of quiet pride. For the first time in years, he felt whole. He stepped off the stage and hugged his daughter tightly when she ran to him. You were amazing, she said with a huge smile. He laughed softly, holding her close. And in that moment, he knew he wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. And this new beginning, this new purpose, was the start of a life he never thought he could have again.